everyone. Thank you for joining the 26th annual Duke Law National Security Law Conference. And I think this year is going to be the biggest and best that we've ever had. And I'm particularly thrilled to kick off this event with two good friends who are super smart and who are going to talk to us about one of the hottest issues in the national security realm, and that's the impact of artificial intelligence on warfare. I'm going to introduce our speakers very, very briefly, but before I do that, I want to let you know that we are being recorded. This event is being recorded. And if you want to ask a question, I'm very hopeful we will be able to get to some questions. I would ask you to use the function, the question function, and we'll get to as many as we can. Our panelists are very distinguished. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rebecca Krutoff from the University of Richmond. She's one of these people who's kind of scary smart because she not only has her law degree from Yale, she also has a PhD from Yale. And what's really most interesting about her, and I think her undergraduate major was something like electrical engineering or and English, one of those crazy sorts of things. But what's really interesting about her is that she's a very nice person. And whenever we're on a panel together, she always pretends like I'm as smart as she is, even though we both know that really isn't true. But I'm really happy to have her here. I'm also thrilled to have Brigadier General Pat Houston. General Houston is, his official title right now is he's the Assistant Judge Advocate General for Military Law and Operations. He went to West Point. He has his own set of degrees. He has a master's from the Army War College, I think. He has his LLM from the Army JAG School, which incidentally is the only entity in DOD, which is a Navy approved law school, and he commanded that. But the other interesting thing about Pat is that he was also a Army Ranger. He was a helicopter pilot, and he has served 5 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. So General Houston, we're really super glad to have you here. I'm going to start out this dialogue, this conversation, with just throwing it out to the both of you. How do you define artificial intelligence, and how does that work into the national security space?
Well, so there's a bit of a tendency to move the goalposts when we're defining AI. People used to say that we would have AI when a computer could beat a human at chess, and then when that happened, they said, "Oh no, that was easy. It's when when a computer could beat a human at Go. That's when we'll have AI." And then that happened, and so I think instead of sort of trying to define a limiting factor on AI, it's much better to think of AI as this umbrella term that covers a variety of information processing techniques that are used to achieve some sort of goal. So this could be search engines or navigation systems, medical diagnostics, weather prediction. There's a whole host of uses. There are 2 main forms of AI. One is a relatively stable decision tree, a sort of series of if-then statements. And that's going to be really, really useful when we know the kind of decision-making process that we want to replicate, and we either just want to offload it or speed it up in some way. Then there's machine learning systems, and huge complex topic, but just to boil it down, they're usually best when we want to develop some sort of independent problem solving or identification capabilities. So that might be identifying images of a cat, or identifying images of tumors, or coming up with unexpected go moves. And all of these different systems have their own distinctive strengths and vulnerabilities. I also think it's worth noting that AI is sometimes described along a spectrum in terms of how flexible it is. At the lowest end is weak or narrow AI. This is AI that can do one task really, really well, like play chess or identify tumors. But it can't do anything else. And that's pretty much all of the AI that is in use today. So when we talk about AI, we're talking about these really non-flexible systems that are good at one thing. Next level up is strong or general AI that's going to be good at multiple different kinds of tasks. So maybe it could play chess and identify tumors. And this doesn't yet exist. This is what a lot of researchers are working on now. And then at the highest level would be something that's often called artificial superintelligence, something that completely surpasses human intelligence and shows up a lot in science fiction and is really purely speculative at this point. And it's really fun to think about, to create thought experiments around. It's nowhere near actually happening.
Pat, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, well, thanks, General Dunlap. Thanks, Dr. Krudoff. I'm thrilled to be back here at Duke for this premier event. Let me start by sharing two things that you won't find on my bio. Number one, I'm a human rights lawyer. I've spent my entire career focused on enforcing international humanitarian law, protecting civilians, and making the inhumane endeavor of war as humane as it can be. Second, I'm not a true pacifist in the absolute sense of the word, but I'm about as close as you can get. I believe in using military force only as an absolute last resort. And my view on this is shaped by my experience as both a soldier and a lawyer. As a soldier, I know that war is an ugly thing, and nearly every soldier who's been in combat is eager to avoid it if at all possible. As a lawyer, I firmly believe in the rule of law, just like everyone in this audience here. And international law is very clear that military force should be used only as a last resort. So now I tell you these two things, that I am a human rights lawyer and a near pacifist, because frankly, they're not traits that most people tend to associate with an Army general. And I want to make sure you understand my perspective as we go into this dialogue. Okay, so now that Dr. Krudoff has taught us all at least how to spell AI, let's talk a little bit about it. And I'll tell you why I'm here. First of all, I love this stuff, the intersection of law and technology, especially AI because of its tremendous potential. But also, the Pentagon is the world's biggest user of AI. We're the largest employer in America with over 3 million employees, all of whom I'll note worked and reported to General Mattis when he was the Secretary of Defense. We have a $750 billion annual budget, and we have about 1,000 formal AI programs that are out there. I'll also note that we have one of the largest legal teams with over 5,000 attorneys, many of whom are focused on these technology issues. Now, when we talk about AI programs, everyone assumes that we're talking about killer robots. But the key point I want you to remember here for our discussion today is that the vast majority of AI programs in the Pentagon are benign, innocuous programs that are simply designed to increase efficiency and reduce costs. Just like every other large organization or corporation across America or frankly, the world. And I want to give you one example of this. It's called AI-powered smart maintenance programs. And if you don't know what that is, I'll give you sort of an example to help frame it. My last two cars were a pickup truck and a BMW. The maintenance on my pickup truck was simple. I changed the oil every 5,000 miles. But the BMW was different. It had an AI-powered smart maintenance system, and it knows that if you change the oil too frequently, you're simply wasting time and money. But if you wait too long to change the oil, you risk a massive breakdown and repair expenses. So this AI system is looking for the optimum time to change the oil. It tracks exactly how I drive. Am I aggressive or am I very gentle? What are the conditions under which I'm driving? Rough conditions, hot weather, or very mild conditions on the open, gentle highway where I'm not doing a lot of acceleration and deceleration. It takes all my data, my repair data, it compares it to every other BMW driver and BMW repair data out there. It learns as each new piece of data comes in, and it tells me exactly when I should change the oil to optimize the cost. Now, for the Pentagon, here's why this is important. We have thousands of boats and ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, helicopters, airplanes, and literally hundreds of thousands of tanks, trucks, and other ground vehicles. And if we could optimize the maintenance schedule for these, we can save billions in taxpayer dollars. So that's just one example of what is the normal AI program that the Pentagon is pursuing right there to improve the efficiency. Now, again, I know there are other projects out there like killer robots that we're going to dive into, but I want you to understand that the bulk of the projects are not killer robots.
What about the weaponization? Dr. Kruthoff?
I'll be the one to talk about the killer robots part. First, I realized I was so excited to jump into the discussion that I neglected to thank everyone, to thank you, General Dunlap, to thank all the organizers as well, and had that moment like, oh, but okay.
Trust me, I do that all the time at these things. I'm
like,
probably
let's
the rudest.
get into it. All right, so yes, there's a host of I won't say non-militarized, but non-weaponized uses of artificial intelligence that it's really important to not lose sight of. That being said, I'm going to talk about some of the lethal uses of artificial intelligence. So there's two main ways in which AI can be used, or AI might affect decisions regarding the use of lethal force. The first is rapidly becoming more part of the vernacular, autonomous weapon systems. Autonomous weapon systems that are capable of making independent selecting and engaging targets based on a combination of data that they gather while in the field and pre-programmed constraints that direct their decision making. It's important to note these are not drones. Right, these are distinct from drones. Drones have a human in the loop who are often making either the targeting or the selection of target decisions. Autonomous weapon systems, many times the conception of them is that the human is on the loop or off the loop entirely. Also want to note, they are not the Terminator. They are not some sci-fi futuristic weaponry. Also, the Terminator was a semi-autonomous weapon system insofar as it had its target selected for it. Better fictional analogy would be Skynet or Lieutenant Commander Data or R2-D2. All of them were independent autonomous weapon systems. It's also worth noting they're not futuristic weaponry, right? They're not weapons that don't exist yet. Over 30 states are already fielding autonomous weapon systems or weapon systems that are capable of being autonomous weapon systems in their militaries today. And there's a ton of interest in future R&D. There was just a report that came out today about a new autonomous weapon system that Russia is fielding. The second aspect of the way in which AI can be used in decisions regarding the use of lethal force are AI decision assistants. There's a lot of focus on autonomous weapon system, relatively little discussion of AI decision assistants. And I think that's problematic because I think they're arguably going to have even more of an impact on decision making than autonomous weapon systems, mostly just because they're going to play so many different roles, right? So AI is going to be used in gathering information, in processing, in analyzing that information, in assessing potential threats, as alert systems, in recommending targets, and so on and so forth. And I'm particularly interested in this because I think there's a lot of opportunities for errors and accidents in these processes that it's going to be critical to pay attention to as they're developed further. So my guess is there's going to be a bigger conversation happening around AI decision assistance that we're going to see, but sort of it's just on the verge of starting right now.
General Houston, do you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, absolutely. What I'd like to do is highlight an important paradigm shift in how technology is developed. It's pretty simple, but it's really important for reasons that we'll discuss a little bit. But we'll start with the old model, the 20th century technological development model, where most technology in both the US and the world, the high tech, was driven largely by the US military. Government-funded research and development, government labs and grants. This was a slow cycle where technology was developed first for the military over a decades-long industrial age process. It was slow, but it produced impressive results at the end, such as a stealth bomber. So think of all the 20th century technologies, the big ones: nuclear technology, the space race, aviation technology, computers, GPS, even the internet itself, all of that first developed for the military or either by the military or for the military, and then later migrated for civilian use. Now, here's the paradigm shift. What we have now is essentially the exact opposite. The 21st century model is that most new technology that's being developed is being developed by the commercial sector for private markets. Think AI, all the different uses of AI, encryption, email, telephone encryption, collaborative robots, 5G communications out there, developed by the giants like Apple, Microsoft, and Google, but also hundreds of small tech startups, entrepreneurs out there, all of them developing in this competitive market at the speed of market, which is super fast. And then the military comes in now, looks for the technology that we need to leverage, and we purchase it off the shelf so that we can then integrate it into the military programs. So what's the takeaway for this technological change? Well, there are two. The first is that you need to forget everything you've ever heard about defense contracting because that no longer works. We've completely changed the defense contracting model to account for this new technology model. That's not why we're here to discuss today, so not really applicable here. The second one, though, is very important because it impacts arms control efforts. This technology is being developed in the civilian sector primarily for commercial uses, and then it's migrated for military uses. So it's there on the shelf. It's very difficult to put it back in the box, very difficult to control the development of this technology, and it makes it very hard to control the spread of this technology to implement effective arms control out there as we leverage that technology. So I think that's important for us to think about. And one other thought on this too is it kind of leads me back to the discussion of the killer robots and my roots as a human rights lawyer. I really believe that AI has the potential to make warfare more humane, or at least less inhumane. I know that Dr. Krutoff mentioned some of the risks. There are some of those, and we will discuss those. But we're looking at ways to how we can leverage AI on the battlefield to improve battlefield awareness, and then hopefully reduce one of the great tragedies of war, which is civilian casualties out there. Some might even argue that if this technology exists and can do that, we have an obligation to pursue it. Now, I am not naive about this. We can't just go around sprinkling AI pixie dust on everything and hoping it'll be better. There are risks. We've already raised a couple of them. And as I said, only a small portion of our projects are weapons, but that's really where the risks exist. I'll tell you that of the weapons programs that we have, they're divided into both offensive and defensive. I'm going to start with the defensive because it's the least controversial. I want to give you an example of something that anyone in the audience who's been in either Iraq, Afghanistan, or another combat zone knows, and it's called the CRAM. It's a defensive system, counter rocket, artillery, and mortar. Essentially what it is, it's a radar that's scanning the sky, looking for incoming artillery rounds. And when it finds one, it locks onto the artillery round. It has this big loudspeaker that it tells everyone in a huge voice that says, take cover, incoming artillery. Now, for that reason, and obvious reasons, everyone calls this thing the big voice, but it's the CRAM. It announces this, it locks on, it also has a machine gun, and it tries to shoot this incoming round out of the sky. So hopefully what happens is you will hear the big voice say, take cover, incoming rounds. You'll hear a machine gun burst, and if all goes well, you'll hear a boom of the artillery round impacting harmlessly in the sky. And all this happens in a couple of seconds because that's all the time that there is without any human intervention, because it really has to operate autonomously to operate within the limited time that it has. So again, everyone acknowledges that there are risks and that these autonomous systems can significantly alter the nature of warfare, especially when used offensively, where they're picking the targets and those targets are humans. And that's what drives the controversy. That's what gets all the attention. But I'll tell you that the three things the Pentagon is really trying to do here is include human-machine teaming, the right mix of both, maintaining appropriate human judgment in the process. I know we're going to talk about this, and then make sure that people are accountable for the use of these systems. I think this is a good recipe going forward as a way to help mitigate some of those risks.
Rebecca, Dr. Krutoff, I got like 6 million questions that come up in my mind. Let's talk about the basic one. you're familiar with how this technology is being used in the marketplace and so forth. And given what General Houston said about, militaries historically have always taken what's in the commercial realm and used it. What do you think the prospects are of the killer robot ban? Is that even technologically feasible, even assuming people wanted to do it?
Yeah, I mean, so there are a gazillion legal debates around the use of AI in warfare, and General Houston alluded to one of them, which is, right, do you have an obligation to use more advanced weaponry sometimes, right? That's its own debate right there. But the most prominent one, I think the most public one, is this question of whether or not, or to ban autonomous weapon systems entirely. Like groups like the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots have done a phenomenal job of raising and highlighting and focusing on this question. I think it's really, really important anytime we're talking about spending the resources and the political capital and the time and energy to create a treaty, that it's also worth spending a lot of time thinking about whether or not this treaty is likely to be successful. And so I've long had the stance, right, that before we focus over much on should we ban a particular kind of weapon or weapon system, we should also be thinking about can we. And I did a historical study of different types of weapons bans, including prohibitions on crossbows, on chemical weapons, on permanently blinding laser weapons, and distilled a bunch of different factors that seem to weigh for or against a type of ban likely being successful. Of these factors, when you apply them to autonomous weapon systems, some are inconclusive, some cut both ways, because many times an autonomous weapon system is going to be a delivery system. And so you could outfit it with horrible weapons or with less lethal weapons. But most of the factors weighed against a ban likely being successful. And I can drop a sort of short version of that.
It is hard to imagine because I think AI is going to penetrate our lives in all different dimensions. It's hard for me to imagine that somehow the military dimension would be excluded from that. It seems too attractive. But let me jump in and ask another question. People are talking about meaningful human control, but I'm not quite sure what that is. And here's my specific concern. I can see AI applications in the cyber realm, and we're looking at hypervelocity of war. I'm wondering, what would that mean? What does meaningful human control in a lethal autonomous weapon system, what does that look like, or what should it look like in the real world? Either one.
I'll just start briefly by saying that I think it's a sliding scale. I don't think there's a fixed answer to that. I think it depends on how good the technology is and most importantly, how reliable it is. The more reliable it is, the more confidence you have in what it's going to do, the less human involvement is probably necessary. The less reliable it is, obviously, the more you have to do to invoke human judgment to ensure that things don't go astray. So that's a simple, short answer.
So I think meaningful human control is an incredibly attractive phrase, right? Like it's a great phrase. Who's going to be against meaningful human control, right? I think it's also legislatively, or from like a lawmaker perspective, it's very attractive because it's one of those phrases that everybody can agree on without defining what it means. And in the same way that we have other very broad tech neutral prohibitions on the use of weapon systems that cause superfluous injury and suffering, or weapon systems that are inherently indiscriminate, to me, this fits right alongside those big, broad guidance, articulates an important principle that everyone can agree on, but that states are just going to fight over in actual practice. And so I don't know how much regulatory force the phrase is going to have. I'll note I have a concern about the phrase insofar as we have worked so hard to establish some baseline rules in warfare. And I am concerned about the potential of using a phrase like meaningful human control to undermine other humanitarian protections that we have, right? I can see situations where we might have a weapon system that's more precise, but it involves less human control. And I would be concerned about the argument for meaningful human control being used to minimize the use of more precise weaponry that would better accomplish the goals of distinction and proportionality.
It seems to me, and either one of you can jump in here, it seems to me that we should be focused on the outcome of the use of the weapon. In other words, is it as good or better than a human, would be in the absence of artificial intelligence? Or is there something wrong with that analysis? And where I think the challenge is when something you raised earlier, Dr. Krutoff, about learning machines. That to me is the real challenge of AI. There are AI kind of system, CIWS, Patriot missile, they have autonomous modes and so forth. But I think it's the learning machine that's the challenge. And because even if you tested it 5 minutes later, it's learned something new. And so what's the outcome? Both of you, what are your thoughts on that? Can we go to kind of an effects-based legal analysis? Hey, this thing is better than a human. And that raises the very interesting, what I call with my students, the 3-beer conversation of whether there's a legal obligation to use a high-tech weapon if it's available, and how much of a nation's treasure then has to be devoted to doing that. But let's just focus on maybe the simpler part about, should we be concerned about the meaningful human control, or should we be concerned about what we reasonably believe this system is going to deliver on the battlefield in the legal context of international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict?
I'll start on that, and I'll say I think it's a false dichotomy to think that we can only do one or the other. I think both are important considerations and have to be in the mix. Starting with the effects, I think it's important that if these can produce more humane, more precise, less inhumane effects, I think it's a very important consideration. Not the end all of the discussion, but very important. I said before, I'm a near pacifist, but I'm also a realist. Overall, I believe in the use of force to deter aggression. And I believe in winning. I'm very competitive, but winning in this context is not fighting. It's deterring aggression point where you never have to fight. And so we have to, from my perspective, deterrence starts with the obligation to have weapons that are effective, or create effective deterrent out there. Now, I acknowledge that for those who are morally opposed to the use of force in every circumstance, that are completely opposed to weapons, my deterrence argument is not going to be very convincing. But for the rest of us out there, I will tell you that the military is very concerned with all of those considerations. And we look at the Pentagon's AI principles, I think it demonstrates a complete commitment to following international humanitarian law, as well as appropriate ethics considerations that are out there as we develop AI and other emerging technologies. Also, these principles require us to strike a balance between autonomous weapons, their capabilities, their potential, and appropriate human decision-making. We've already talked about that and how important that is, but part of it is to maintain control of the systems in case things go wrong, or when things go wrong, for those of us who are more realistic, we know that they will, and so that we can hold humans accountable for appropriate actions out there, because ultimately a human being is responsible for every decision and every use of a system out there. And finally, that the systems have to be capable, or these systems do have the capacity to be very effective. As you said, this is kind of the results base, to change the speed and nature of fighting, which from a deterrence standpoint can be very important. It can also be important from the risk standpoint of unintended escalation out there. But everything is relative in global competition. You can't fall behind. And as I said, I like to win. But as we're talking about the effects here, I think it's really important as we look at some of the concerns, some of the bad things that can happen with these systems, we have to look at who it is out there who are the end users of these systems on the battlefield, right? Most of these use of force decisions in combat are not made by lawyers or law professors sitting in classrooms. They're not made by generals sitting in comfortable armchairs here in the Pentagon, right? They're made by 19-year-olds who are tired and hungry and scared and either freezing cold or sweating profusely out there. And they're confused because chaos is one of these traditional factors that's ever present in battle out there. And so what you end up with is these young soldiers and Marines literally fighting for their lives and making spur of the moment decisions based on imperfect information. So it shouldn't surprise us that the results are sometimes ugly out there. So the question is, can AI be used to improve the results? I really think it can. I don't think that's the only consideration, but I think it's a very important one. So I appreciate you raising that.
I mean, Dr. Krutov, I do want to, you've done so much work on the idea of responsibility. I'm having a hard time with
We
the
can all
doctor.
be on a first name basis.
But let me jump ahead to a question that we've gotten from an attendee. And it kind of goes to this issue that we've been talking about. Addison Crusoe says, as the human element is increasingly removed from war, even if killer robots are far off, do you think that countries will become less reluctant to go to war to use military force because they could tell their publics that, you know, hey, this is the most discriminate use of force and we're not going to be putting people, you know, our own people at risk and so forth? Dr. Krutov, how about do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Ken Anderson has a great piece about do certain things make war too easy versus easier, right? And that's an important distinction to take into account, right? Sometimes something can be too easy, right? And over incentivized, and sometimes something can be easier, and trying to like sort of find that line, everyone's going to disagree on where that is. I think unquestionably we've already seen robotization and sort of force multipliers associated with robotic systems, be they drones or autonomous weapon systems. We've already seen how that's made the recourse to the use of force easier in the United States, right? Like we've seen that there have been justifications for getting involved in various countries that have been grounded on the idea, well, there will be no American boots on the ground because we're just using drones. And so I think unquestionably this is already a process that has started to happen to a certain degree. I think it's exacerbated by cyber, right? And the ability to engage in cyber operations below the force threshold as well. And so I think this is something to pay attention to as a general trend that will not begin with autonomous weapon systems, but rather like it fosters the further development.
Yeah, and I don't mean to suggest it's necessarily bad. You know, I served in the Somalia operation, and then after that played out, you know, nobody wanted to do anything, you know, particularly in Africa. And I sometimes think there were things that happened where a relatively small use of force might have, you know, saved some lives, but it wasn't. So Pat or General Houston.
I think there's some risk of that, but I'm not overly concerned. I'd be more concerned if it was just going to be robots fighting robots, and that was the whole future. I really think the warfare in the future will look painfully similar to warfare of the past, where there will be human suffering, and that has its toll. That's bad, but it also is a forcing function that keeps the truth and the harms of combat very much on the forefront of everyone's mind. I don't think people will be too eager to jump into warfare. There's another element of the question that really resorts to just evolution, period. There's always a problem with evolution making warfare easier. I don't think there's any real way to stop that.
And I just wanted to jump back quickly to your machine learning question, because to me, this is of the many possible norms that could develop around the use of AI enabled systems. The idea that in-field machine learning should be prohibited seems like a relatively easy requirement for anything that has the capacity to use lethal force. Like that seems like something that it should be relatively easy to get agreement on. And my sense is states can't even agree to that norm, right? That if they have machine learning systems, they want them not only to have to engage in machine learning sort of in the lab, right, in the sandbox, as it were, but also they want to retain the capacity to have them learn in field. And that is a huge concern to me in terms of potential loss of control, potential loss of an understanding of what the system has the capacity to do or how it might react in different situations. And so I would love to see more agreement around even that basic level of norm about when we allow machine learning to happen.
Yeah,
And yet we don't have that.
I'm wondering if, nations think that if I don't let my machine learn, then the other machine's going to get smarter than my machine. So ergo, I have to let it learn. General Houston, let me put you a little bit on the spot here because you referenced, DoD has come out with these ethics principles related to AI. And retired General Russ Kilpatrick has posed the question, and I'm going to paraphrase it. Whose ethics are we using? There are lots of ethical traditions in the world, and they aren't all ours. And as you know, in the military justice system, you can't you can't impose your own ethical system in deciding whether or not you're going to obey an order. I'm a little surprised that they use that terminology because it would seem to me it's more policies. But if you call them ethics, can you ever really change them without losing the narrative that all of a sudden, oh, well, you're going to be acting unethical now? What are your thoughts on that? And
I agree.
Krutov, I'd like your thoughts as well.
I think they are really policy concerns. We all know that there is the minimum baseline that everyone on Earth has to follow, the international legal norms. Those create the minimum standard. If we want to go above that, we want to post something above that, there are all sorts of ways we could term it. I think ethics principles is one way. We could also just call it policy restrictions that are elevated. And I think there are a mixture thereof, or perhaps one and the same. I think that we're saying, hey, these are good ideas. International law may not mandate this, but just for the time being, as we're testing this stuff out, as we're trying to be responsible stewards bringing this technology to bear, then we should look very careful at these issues. We should have some elevated standards for ourselves and follow through. Recognizing that it wouldn't be a violation of international law, it'd just be a violation of these standards or we can adjust them later if it turns out to be appropriate.
Dr. Krutov?
I think that's a great point, especially the concern about being able to modify them as we learn more about how we actually operationalize the use of AI. I think the aim was to highlight that there are more factors that we want to, and I wasn't, this is my interpretation, right? The aim was to emphasize there are more factors that we want to think about than just what is going to be most instrumental or what is going to be, legal. And so using that framing, the ethics framing, got at the we can but should we question, right? Or Harold Coe's like it might be lawful but is it awful question. Mm-hmm. And so I appreciate that framing, but I hadn't thought about the potential for difficulty in modifying them as we learn more. I like that. That's interesting.
Yeah, again, that it's funny how you carry certain baggage with you. That really struck me during the Somali operation because there's a book out called Warrior's Honor that talks about how even the Somali, tribes and so forth, they had their own sense of honor, but it was specific to that group where it's particularist. Whereas in the West, we have a generalist idea of applying ethical principles. So I do think that people have different constructs, but we've also raised, we're talking about ethics and limitations, but let's talk about hard accountability. How are we going to do that? I have my own ideas of how you do that, but I would really be interested to hear yours, because it's brought up so often, who's going to be accountable with respect to autonomous weapon systems.
I guess I'll throw out a couple of comments. One of the top kind of practical tips that I would offer anyone who's going to adopt AI technology is this concept of human and machine teaming. And the notion is that there are certain things that humans do better than machines: judgment, common sense, but other things that the machines can do better than humans: the rapid computations, the consumption of massive amounts of data, repetitive tasks where humans would grow bored and start to not pay attention. And what is often presented as an either or decision, like you want to go with the humans or you're going to pick the machine. And I think what we've learned is the importance of kind of merging and picking the best of both. And you take the things that humans do best and you merge that with the things that the machines do best and combine it into human machine teaming, where you're taking the best of both. Part of it is, as I said before, ultimately, there's going to be a human who makes the decision to employ a system, whether it's different decision points along the way, or simply at the beginning saying, I'm going to turn this thing off, turn this thing on, and let it loose on the battlefield. But those humans who make these decisions are responsible. They must be held accountable. That's a fundamental part, not only of the US ethics system, of our ethics principles for the Pentagon, but I think underpinning international humanitarian law and commanders' accountability out there. I think that's the way we're going to keep everyone honest, is making sure that they are held accountable.
Dr. Krutzoff, I know you've done.
I'm like, how do I keep my remarks on this shorter than 2 hours?
Just for the audience, I was on a panel with her on kind of this topic, and I made some offhand comment, and it was like a intellectual B-52 strike that came down on my head. So
okay, great. Now with this,
I've learned my lesson. So.
Oh, okay, so I think first on human machine teaming, right? It's undoubtedly the way in which most of these systems are going to be operationalized. That's why I like talking about AI decision assistants, is because they're going to play a role in the decision making. They won't necessarily be making the decisions. And it's often discussed as this like marriage of strengths, right? Let's take the best of what humans do well, the flexibility, and the best of what machine intelligence does well, and maximize that. It is really critical to be aware that both human and machine intelligence have unique weaknesses, and that sometimes human machine teaming can result in maximizing both of those as well, or creating entirely new ones specialized to human machine teaming, right? And so this is where we see issues like skill fade, right? Where we become over reliant as human beings on the system. I am certainly much worse at like navigating now that I have a navigation assistant. There's automation bias where humans over trust what the machine tells them. There's been some studies done where humans trust things that they're told are less than 100% accurate more than they trust non-automated or AI-like devices that they're told are 100% accurate, but require the human to do some work as part of the decision making. We've already had situations where people have followed their GPS directions and driven into lakes, into bays, into oceans, right, into all sorts of things. And this over trust is hugely dangerous when you have systems that have some built-in sources of error in them. And that has really huge implications for accountability, because while I certainly agree that individual responsibility is really important when we're talking about war crimes, right? When we're talking about situations where any individual acts with either the intention to violate international humanitarian law or recklessly violates international humanitarian law, it is critical, like socially, as a matter of law, as a matter of military decision making, to have accountability, individual accountability for those situations. I think most of the time what we're going to see with AI is we're going to see unpredictability resulting from and problems, and sometimes maybe even disasters, resulting from unpredictable accidents. new kinds of weapons malfunction due to bugs in the code, new kinds of user error like automation bias, new kinds of information error where something was trained on the wrong training set, right, or for the situation, new kinds of communication error, right, when you have human and machine intelligences interacting with each other, a lot can get lost in translation in really dangerous ways. And when you take all these new sources of error into account, I think it's often really unfair to hold the individual accountable. And so my argument is that we need a broader, more systemic accountability system that anticipates that accidents will happen and creates, ways of holding the structural system that contributed to the creation of the accident responsible or liable. And in that case, this is generally going to be the state that's fielding these systems.
Kind of a pre-Nuremberg analysis of accountability.
Yeah, I'd like to.
Chair Houston, let me ask you this. I do think, I happen to agree with you that I think the accountable, if we do need to come to accountability, and we tend to want to have that, especially in the military, it is going to be the commander who decides to employ the system. Harvey Rishikoff has asked about going further back, the coder and so forth. Under military law, we can find derelictions of duty and so forth. But let's get the well-meaning commander. What is going to be reasonable in that circumstance? Because some of these systems are almost unknowable as to how they're actually operating. What would be the due diligence? What would be reasonable under those circumstances? And we see in cyber, if you look in the Tallinn manual, it talks about it's not unreasonable for a commander to rely upon the expertise of somebody on the staff, his or her staff. What are your thoughts about that? What would be do we have to have some kind of, test bed results
Yeah, this raises a great question. It also ties into what Dr. Kudov just talked about, with which I agree, and also the changing nature of AI. The issue here is that, yes, the commanders have to act reasonably. And it's been a long time since I've been in law school, but I do know that reasonableness is a totality of the circumstances test. So we're not going to have a fixed formulaic definition of it, but it's going to be based on sort of the reliability. And yes, people don't understand exactly how AI works, but I'll tell you, I don't need to understand how the electronic computerized transmission system works in my car. I need to know that when I press on the gas, it goes faster, that when I press on the brake, it slows down. I don't need to understand exactly what happens in between. Here, we need to understand and have a reasonable degree of confidence. If we do X, this is the outcome. What makes it trickier here is that the systems change. Exactly as Dr. Kudov, this learning systems, hopefully they learn and improve, but we know that doesn't always happen. Sometimes they learn and they get worse. So they learn and they change. So with the system you have on Monday is different than the system you have on Tuesday. I would say there are two things that we can do in the system to address that. The first is to get lawyers involved in the process early on. And let me give you an example of developing a system where this could come in handy. Let's say we're developing an autonomous targeting system that uses facial recognition technology. It gains perfect access to the photographs of every member of the enemy's army. And we can, with 100% certainty, identify with using facial recognition technology that person X, let's call this, Sergeant Houston, has been identified. Therefore, as an enemy combatant, can the system take that person out? If we base this solely on coders, we let coders develop this system, it's going to say, yes, they're an enemy combatant, they can be taken out. But what if the person's raising his or her hands in surrender, or she has a Red Cross armband on as a medical system, or is wounded and out of combat? All these different criteria that we know make someone not targetable. We have to have a lawyer involved in the process early on to make sure that the coders are applying the proper legal standard and that these systems are going to do in all these circumstances what we intend them to do. Again, I'm not saying it has to be perfect. We talked about the imperfection of the American soldier out there, or any soldier around the world. We want it to be better than that, and I think we can, in many cases, have it be better than that. The other thing, because the system changes, we have to make sure that our legal reviews of these systems, we don't just create a system and throw it out there. We have to test it. We have to have some reasonable degree of certainty about what it's going to do. And then for AI systems, we have to have recurring legal reviews when we think the system's going to change. So what, again, the legal review from Monday might not be valid on Friday, and we have to think about how we continue to look at these systems, continue to evaluate them. Commanders have the same obligations to continue to evaluate them as they change.
It seems to me this makes it incumbent upon the lawyers involved to really get into the technology. You're going to have to be a technologist. I can remember, when being in command centers doing air operations, you had to know a lot about the system because what was going to happen if it went dumb, and where would the overflight, would it go into a whole nother country, and what are the consequences of that? Dr. Krutoff, I know you've thought a lot about this in many different ways. I'm thinking that we are going to learn a lot from the commercial world and what they find to be accountable, activities in terms of, say, tort law. I think you've done something on war torts at some point in your life, or even criminal liability. What are your thoughts? Because we've had a number of questions from the audience about accountability and so forth.
So, yeah, so the interesting thing about the commercial or civilian nature of these technologies is there's the goal is not to kill anybody, right? And picked out killing the right person. And so with a certain number of these systems, there's the ability, one, to work in spaces where it's possible to catch errors and return to a status quo ante, right? So when unexpected errors occur, like the stock market flash crash or Amazon algorithms bidding a book up to $10,000, you can stop it and go back in a way that you might not be able to in an area of active conflict. And sort of on that point, in terms of machine learning systems, General Houston mentioned the issues with machine learning systems. I think it's also important to recognize that any system built on code has a lot of these problems built in, right? And so rocking on with the car analogy, Toyota, allegedly had a software glitch that resulted in unexpected acceleration, right? So you got your Toyota and you expected to brake, and instead it accelerated. And those kinds of errors are coming from non-machine learning systems as well. And so it's worth recognizing that these accidents are all over the place. Oftentimes, in terms of domestic tort liability, there's a bunch of arguments that we can't ever hold programmers responsible for these kinds of accidents because they're unpreventable, because they're going to happen no matter what. Instead, the best we can do is sort of impose a sort of like after the fact tax, right? Like a sort of a fine or pay compensation to the victims, because no matter what you do on the front end, it's not possible to avoid some of these bugs and these programming errors that result in accidents. And that's why I think changing the context is so important to keep in mind about using these systems and their potential risks.
We've had a question from a student, kind of follow up to something that you brought up, Pat, or General Houston. Gina Bianchi asks, you talk about the weapon being different on Monday than it may be on Thursday. Should there be a systematized, timing regular audits and so forth, or should we have an AI system that monitors the AI system to give us predictive audit, timing?
I think the answer is yes. There should be some regular reviews, but I think it's going to vary from system to system to system. Some might need to be reviewed every hour, others every year, but it's just going to depend. But absolutely yes. And I think that's part of our obligation as legal advisors, to help our clients know how frequently we need to do that in order to make sure that we have confidence in the outcomes.
We are getting short of time. There are a lot of questions. I won't be able to get to them all, but we have quite a few law students and junior officers here. Let me ask you both this question, and I'll start with you, General Houston. What is the Army going to do to prepare its JAGs to advise in these high-tech systems. And for you, Dr. Krutoff, what do you recommend for law students? I mean, how do you get smart? Are there books out there, or are there courses? How do you blend a legal career with the kind of expertise that I think is inevitably, you just can't dive into this and without, some level of expertise? Pat?
We've already started to weave this into our curriculum as we train all of our new attorneys out there. For the law students out there, for the new attorneys, I'll just tell you that it is a fascinating opportunity to practice law in this area. A lot of opportunities, high tech, that you just couldn't get into, I don't think, if you were going straight out of law school into a firm or a corporate counsel role where you have direct access to do some amazing things. As I've told other people in the past, if you're in law school for the money, we're not the firm for you. But if you want adventure and you want some fascinating legal issues on some really important global issues that you can provide real-time advice on, come check us out. I think you'll have a lot of fun enjoying the practice as a member of this team.
Dr. Krutoff, what's your recommendation for law students? Is this something that maybe, instead of looking for the traditional law firm, maybe general in-house counsel for a firm? And how do you prepare yourself? You got into this when, kind of before it was fashionable to get into it. Is there something from your own experience that you could share with the students? And
I got into autonomous weapon systems when you could read all the legal literature about autonomous weapon systems in one weekend, because that's what I did. I sat down and did it. Yeah, I think in terms of if you're at the law school level, the fundamentals of the law are critical here, right? So the fundamentals of tort law, of criminal law, of international law, of the law of armed conflict, of national security law, like all of those traditional black letter classes, that's the content and the knowledge and and understanding how legal reasoning works, and when you can use analogy to stretch an old law, or when you might need to make new law, and thinking about whether that new law should be more tech neutral or tech specific. Like, these are all the overarching skills that will continue to be relevant and necessary as we move from drones to cyber operations to autonomous weapon systems to AI to whatever, quantum, and whatever's coming next. So one point is the black letter stuff remains constantly important, and the skill set remains constantly important. I think a lot of law students I've talked to are scared off by the tech aspect. They think like, oh, I don't know how to do that stuff. And so it sounds so fascinating, but I should steer clear. And I think there's so many contributions to be made by people who aren't, you don't have to be a coder. You should be like comfortable talking about technology and ready to learn about new technologies and their capabilities, but you do not need to be an engineer. You do not need to be a coder to get involved and have an impact and to be of use on this subject.
Yeah, I think the emphasis on the basic blocking and tackling of the practice of law is really interesting as we look to new technologies. I think we have like 20 seconds left if you have any final words, General Houston.
Yeah, I'll just say thanks a lot for this opportunity. The one AI aspect that scares the hell out of me, I think we've talked about this, is deep fakes. It's the thing out there, it's deep fake technology. I think it can completely undermine judicial systems. It can undermine global stability. And I think it's really important that the Pentagon works with private industry and with academia to help solve these deep fakes and detect them and get it put on.
Well, the audience will be pleased to know that tomorrow we'll have Aaron Wirtanen from the CIA, who's going to be making a presentation on deep fakes. And Pat, I think you know her, and I think, Rebecca, you do as well. And she'll give a good presentation. I think she has the same sense as you. Rebecca, take us home here.
Oh.
Or Dr.
My
Krutoff,
biggest
take us
concern
home.
has been pretty obvious. I'm concerned that we're so focused on capabilities, we're not paying as much attention to the potential for accidents. So the more that can get interwoven into the conversation, the better all around. Mostly, I want to say thank you for this opportunity, for putting together this phenomenal conference. I'm so looking forward to attending all the future panels and presentations.
Well, I want to thank the both of you for participating and kicking off what I am sure is going to be a great conference. And we really could not have gotten better people on this topic. And there's so much more to learn. And so you should, students out there, start looking for their literature from these two experts. And we're hoping to see you again. And thank you so much. And for everyone else, we're going to be reconvening tomorrow morning. We're going to have a panel on civil military relations. We're going to have General Mattis. We're going to have Ms. Flournoy. We're going to have General Brown, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and many others. So join us then.